So Momus is making a Japanese-sounding folk record, and he's making it in Japan, but he's mixing in images of ancient Rome. And of course, he's even referenced his Wikipedia entry, which starts about how he's fascinated by ancient Rome and sex, time travel, and Japan. So it's almost a return to the origins, the first Momus album, Circus Maximus, which is just actually about to be re-released on a label called Manufactured in America, is set in ancient Rome as well. And at that time it was a subject which interested our young 25-year-old Momus because it seemed Brechtian. The album was going to be called Bread and Circuses, which is a line from Juvenal. People are only interested in Panis et Circenses, Bread and Circuses, which was the equivalent at the time of TV, I guess. And Momus at that time was very interested in popular culture, but also the fact that popular culture was like a kind of candy apple being dangled in front of him that was not accessible to him, that he, being overeducated, agitated, organized and overeducated, was never quite going to fit into popular culture, and that this bread and circuses thing was going to defeat him in the end. And I think that was always on the cards, and so we're coming back to that. But in a way now it's from a very different angle, because our hero is middle-aged. He's 55 years old, and he's now 30 years later, approaching this thing as a way of not being topical, because when you remove yourself from your context of the West and put yourself into a culture as alien as Japan, you no longer have the kind of satirical subject matter that once might have powered you. So he's not in Britain, he's not in London, in a bedsit anymore, and sort of looking out at the King's Road and finding a lot wrong with the consumerist and neoliberal culture of the 1980s. He's in Japan, where he's actually pacing round and round a rather nice industrial loft-style apartment at this moment, looking out at containerized freight going past in the Osaka docks on its way to and from China. And he's reflecting on his own mortality, because I think when you embrace old topics, the ancient world, and this kind of incessant and almost obsessive quest to capture the sound of otherness, which he's doing instrumentally with recorders and just intonation and Japanese folk music, you do it because you want to transcend your actual physical limitations and your temporal limitations. You have a body, and it's in a particular historical time, a time which has been disappointing for Momus. I think it has to be said. It's a time of limited ambition, limited imagination. And that's one reason he's always going back to films. The art films, really, the art house cinema that doesn't exist anymore. Who is our contemporary Fellini? Who is our contemporary Godard? Of course, Godard is still there, but he's a very old man. He's the person who's commented best on the Greek crisis by saying that we should pay the Greeks every time we use the word therefore. Even the brilliance of the Greek politicians in charge of their own particular crisis hasn't come up with a line as good as that. But yeah, I think it's a way to get away from the fact that you're mortal, that you're going to die, because if you're standing on a mountain, literally, when you, or figuratively, when you go back to the ancient world. So we have Satyricon, the very first satirical novel. In fact, some people say the very first novel ever written, which is referenced in the video for candolism, which is the Krafft-Ebing's term for men who want to show off their women to other men, to excite them as though their women's bodies were their own bodies. There's a lot of this kind of escapism, I would say, but it's a kind of realistic escapism, because it comes from a kind of legitimate disgust about oneself or one's time. Momus has escaped from the West and lives in Japan as a kind of continuous protest against continuous neoliberalism, which has stretched 35 years now, and has been something he's tried to escape, either to satirize initially or just to somehow ignore, to act as if it's not happening. And pop music being a commercial and entirely Thatcherite art form in that sense, especially as Momus knew it, starting making it in the 80s, has not been particularly sustaining for him, so he's turned to literature increasingly. But his songs were always very literary and literate. But he's found that the music he's been making, listening to rather, in Japan, which has now become the music he's making, finally this circle also has been completed, that the kind of music he listens to for pleasure is the kind of music that you're hearing him produce with this album, because for the last couple of years he's listened at home really almost exclusively to his collection of Japanese folk 45s, old vinyl, mostly from the 60s. Some of it almost ethnomusicological folk recordings of very old Japanese people who nevertheless have a lot of get up and go, very spunky folk dances, which are done usually at Matsuri festivals or Ondo music, it's called, various types of folk dance which were recorded and released, many of them on a label called King Records in the 60s. So Momus came by these thanks to his friend Satoru, who runs Forever Records in Osaka, and who kindly gave Momus a big stack of what he calls gomi, trash records, which he probably wouldn't be able to sell. This is ironic, a typical irony that Momus interests himself in foreign cultures, like French culture, for instance. Momus was listening as a 25-year-old to lots of Jacques Brel and Serge Gainsbourg and Georges Brassens, Léo Ferré, and he went to France thinking people would embrace him there because of his embrace of this culture. But of course in France people were listening to Jim Morrison and things like that and wanted the Doors, so he came to Japan expecting Japan to be very enamored of his love for Japanese culture, but actually Japanese pop is even more toxically commercial, mainstream, normative and conformist than the pop music of the West. So there was really no harbour, no escape from that in Japan, except in the 90s, this weird kind of period in which Momus songs could somehow be on Music Station, the big commercial TV show here for pop music. But now we live in I think apart from Kyary Pam Pam, who has actually delved quite interestingly, or a producer rather, has delved interestingly into the Japanese folk tradition. There's one or two tracks which are very Matsuri sounding, but it's mainly these crackly old 45 RPM records which he's now going through sampling and reconstructing, turning into new songs which do what Fellini does in the Satyricon, which is he used Japanese music and African ethnographic music to just give a sense of strangeness and distance, temporal distance, time travel to his very spectacular Cinecittà scenes of eunuchs and homosexuals. And so this was a film that Momus first saw at university when he went to the Gay Society's film evening once at a place off Union Street. What an amazing contrast to see Fellini's Satyricon in Aberdeen, this very sober, grim, granite Protestant city. But that's what the film's all about. It's about drawing people away from what they know towards the possibilities of otherness and strangeness, otherworldliness and different moralities. And people love the Roman Empire especially because it's seen as a decay, a caving into decadence and a self-destructive, pleasure-seeking kind of culture. People are always fascinated by doomed, declining civilizations in which people nevertheless seem to be having more fun than we are. So, and Momus is now there is a parallel with Japan, because it's in some sense a declining civilization. Its population is going to shrink to something like 40 million in the next century, and it's obviously going to lose the place in the world it has now. China has overtaken, but or about to overtake Japan. No, it has overtaken Japan, and but it is having a bit of a tumble of its own at the moment, and population-wise, demographically, it's not looking good in the long term for China either. We're going to see India rising, and perhaps the next Momus album will have to be an Indian-themed record and use Indian music. But yeah, that's kind of where it's at with the album, which is being called Glyptothek. Almost a self-parodic title, because of course there's Bibliothek. Bibliothek has a Swedish spelling and Glyptothek has a German one. Glyptothek is a museum of sculpture in Munich. So essentially, when Momus goes back to Europe, he goes to Germany. He feels most at home in Germany, and amongst German people, or amongst Japanese people who live in Germany. And he basically likes Germanic-sounding words. So Glyptothek appealed because it's Greco-German. And of course we could go into the whole thing where Winkelmann, the historian of the classical antiquity that was very much out of fashion until the 18th century, sort of revived the idea of the Renaissance and of the classicism behind it in the 19th century for the Romantics, for the German Romantics specifically. So North Europe reinvented South Europe for its own needs, its own ends, and we're seeing a very interesting thematic developing in contemporary Europe, where the North and the South are having this tussle, Greece and Germany basically. The wise mouse and the foolish mouse, the town mouse and the country mouse, the hedonists and the Protestants. So, and we have the next documenta coming up, which is going to take place both in Kassel and in Athens. And Momus has been paying quite close attention to the so-called Athens Kunsthalle, which in itself, with its name, already tells you there's this fusion, this crossover between Greece and Germany. Kunsthalle being a specifically German art idea. Here in Japan there isn't so much art for Momus to distract himself with, so basically during the rainy season, which is happening just now here in Japan, he doesn't go out on his bicycle so much, and he's got a lot of time in his hands. He doesn't have a job. So he just makes records, and he's described this as possibly the least significant album of all time, because the art form of the album itself, this rather revered and culturally charged long-playing record, which emerged, I guess, in the 60s as a serious artistic statement by people who previously had just been entertainers, and then birthed this whole culture of, first of all an underground press like International Times and Rolling Stone, Cream, all the rest of it, who would give a lot of words and serious, weighty judgments to records as if they were the new form of poetry. They were coming direct from Mount Parnassus. What did Bob Dylan mean, etc., etc. This whole thing is now ebbing away, has disappeared. That we've gone back to music just being a kind of entertainment, or the sound of people doing heteronormative reproductive rituals, getting hitched, dating, whatever, going to the hop. And so, in a sense, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you make the least significant album of all time, because you can be reckless when nothing matters, when you're not going to make a ton of money from a record. You can do the kind of music that you actually like to listen to at home, which is what our friend is doing now.